the oil pressure drop saga on our BRZ. Hello and welcome to Stratified. Now, we are here once again in front of our time attack, daily driven, fun sports car, our BRZ Gen 2. And we've seen a lot of chatter on the internet about a potential issue that this car has that has accounted for a whole bunch of engine failures. And that is oil pressure drops. There are oil pressure drops that happen specifically on right-hand turns and when there are elevation changes. There are some good YouTube videos out there showing and documenting the problem, and because we can't just trust what other people do, I wanted to put a test together to determine if this is an issue on our particular car. As a reminder, our car has had the oil pan removed, the silicone cleaned out, and we have a BRZ baffle installed in this car. So it will be very interesting to see how our data looks. In this particular episode, what we're going to start with is mounting the instrumentation that will allow us to gather the data to show us if there's a problem with oil pressure. Now, there's a few ways to do this, but generally speaking, you will need to mount a sensor somewhere in the engine bay. There are a couple of OEM locations that you can mount the sensor. You can mount it where the OEM pressure switch is. You can mount it, there's a gully at the very top of the engine. But there's also another way to do it, and that is to mount it right where the oil filter sits. And in order to do that, you need something like this. So this is, well, it's actually a pretty simple device. It is a sandwich plate, and it goes between the oil cooler in this car and the oil filter, and it gives you NPT ports to tap into and get pressure, and in our case also temperature. So this is the nice thing about having a sandwich plate like this, is that you can add multiple sensors. We have chosen the gauge to use is the Innovate gauge here, and one of the reasons why we chose this is because they're quite reliable in terms of measurement. We can get a nice visual readout, and it does do temperature, which is across the top here, and it's programmable, as well as oil pressure, which will be a numeric readout. For the sensors, we have a temperature probe, a thermocouple, that is going to thread into one of these, and you can kind of see how it pokes through there, and when oil passes through there, you'll get a temperature reading of the actual oil. And then we also have the pressure sensor. The pressure sensor will come into here, and you can see it doesn't thread very far, and this is an NPT thread, so sometimes some sensors are tapped a little bit deeper than others. We will just tap this a little bit deeper to get the sensor a little bit further seated in, so it doesn't have any issues with vibrations and falling off. Once we have all of this in place, we will mount the gauge inside the car. And this gauge system also allows you to connect to a data logging system that you can also review later. So without further ado, let's get to mounting some instrumentation. Start by removing the oil filter. This will fit as such. And then we have to fit these sensors effectively. This is probably the best option. And then the wiring will go through there and in. And then hopefully, with the filter on top, we will still clear the hood. Like such, into here. And now we can put our oil filter back on and do a little test. So we got our oil adapter sandwich plate in here. You can see how we oriented the sensors so they clear everything, and we still have access to the oil fill in here. They fit in quite nicely. We got Teflon tape on the sensors to prevent any leaks. This is tightened down. Really, this is an easy part of the job, and we are still clearing the hood. It's also soft up here, so we're unlikely to do any sort of damage there with engine movement. So now we're gonna start up the car and see if we've got any profuse leaks of oil. I just want to take a brief moment and discuss why we perhaps want to be picking up the oil pressure and temperature readings from where we're picking them up and not somewhere else. So if you look at an oil filter, and you can see that this oil filter actually has this kind of murky looking oil. So you're probably wondering, why do we have this murky looking oil? Well, actually, because we've treated this particular oil change in this car with a compound made by Liquid Moly and patented by them. That's called Ceratec. Now, this stuff has been used in a whole bunch of cars. I've used it before myself, and the claim to fame is that their additive package actually prevents bearing wear and just frictional wear on the motor, and you only have to treat it once, I believe every 30,000 miles or something like that, and it stays as a coating on the bearings. So it makes that oil during that particular fill look a little bit strange, but it is supposed to, or it's functioning as intended. And I thought, hey, why not? Why don't we give this car that sees track action as much protection as possible? So now back to the pressure reading. So you can see that on your oil filter, you've got these holes on the outside and this big hole on the inside. So basically the oil pump will pump oil through the holes on the outside, and you can see that there's a rubber membrane there, and that's called an anti-drain back valve, so that the oil doesn't completely drain out of the system when you shut off your car. And then it's being filtered through the pleats that are on the outside of the filter, and once it passes through those pleats, it will return through this center hole and it will lubricate the rest of your engine. Now, if we've installed here our plate, you can see that both the pressure sensor and the temperature sensor sit into this outside cavity. So the pressure that we're getting is straight from the oil pump through the OEM oil cooler, which is an oil to water cooler. And then we're measuring the pressure, and the oil will then have another pressure drop across the oil filter before it reaches the rest of the motor. On the temperature side, we're getting the temperature of the oil after it has been pumped by the oil pump and after it has gone through this oil cooler. So I think that this is pretty representative of what's actually lubricating the engine. It's a good place for the oil temperature because this is the temperature of the oil that is going to be going and lubricating the rest of the motor. And it's a good place for the oil pressure because it shows us exactly what the pump is doing before any sort of losses from the oil filter, any sort of pressure drops. So that's why we chose the location for the sandwich plate, and that's why it looks like it's a very common choice. So we're going to put this back on now, and we're going to continue with the installation of the gauge. It's easier to program it while it's outside of the car to get the settings and the warnings that we want. So you can see here this flashing display for the pressure. I've actually set a warning at 19 psi of pressure to flash at me if it's below that, and you can see that this is flashing, so it's the warning is enabled. But in order for you to program the features of the gauge, you need to use the supply cable, and if your computer is USB only, you need a USB to serial device that plugs into this. I know it's a little old school. And then you plug it into the out port on here, and you just power the gauge. You can power with a battery. We have a power supply here in the lab, and you power the gauge. Once you've got all this going, then you want the program, the LM programmer, which is free to download. It will connect as long as you've got the connection, the gauge is powered. And here you give it a name. That's for data logging if you have multiple daisy chained instruments. But under pressure, you can show either PSI or bar, and that's again the center display. And here you can enable the low pressure warning from 0 to 145 PSI, and then that will just flash the display. Under temperature, because it's a range that it sweeps across on the gauge, then you basically program the different ranges. What I've done here is I've matched what our BRZ has on the factory display. So we've got the 50-degree mark, which is the lowest, then we've got the 90, 130, and our display is actually 170 on the car's dash, but there's no way that this thing is going to read 170. It actually tops out at 138. For those that have degrees Fahrenheit inclination, this is what that spread looks like, and this is what matches our BRZ. And I set a high warning for 264, so basically just as it goes from the yellow into the red. So that's our temperature warnings. And you hit program here, and then it asks you to save. It just saves onto the gauge, and now you are ready to finally install this gauge into your dash. Let's see. Okay. There you go. Does it work? Oh. There you go. There we go. We actually didn't need to take that one off. So basically this thing comes out of the car pretty easily, this vent, and then there's 3 clips, 1, 2, 3, that you can easily pry the centerpiece out. Now when your centerpiece is out, this thing is under a little bit of tension there. So now you pull out this really sweet looking thing. Look at that. All right. We put the gauge through. We're gonna need to put some tape on there, on this, to hold it correctly. Oh yeah, there you go. So it doesn't spin or rotate. Now, you can tell it's centered with that. This should come in like this. That part is done. Now, we need to run these wires. Wow, I got this deadly. The gauge is successfully installed into our car. So you've already seen how the sensors are put in the sandwich plate here. Then I followed the OEM harness. Make sure to use some zap straps for strain relief. And I followed all the way underneath here, underneath these fuel line bracket and where the AC lines are. Just follow the OEM harness, and I came into the car using this grommet here. Made a small slit in the grommet. In the name of science. This hurts me a little bit, but this is the only way we could really get the wires in here. So put the wires through there, brought them inside the car. So it's really easy to take this apart. You only need to remove this screw, and then there's one more screw and everything pops off. We've got the gauge pod in here with the gauge, inserted the wires from the gauge, tucked it around here so it's nice and out of the way. Then tuck them right into here. Used an add a fuse. I went for the radio fuse, or I tapped into it. Now there's no good way to put this cover, fuse cover, back on. So what I did is that I used some tape to kind of hold it on in there. It's not the best solution, but this is really awesome tape. I don't think it's gonna fall off. Regardless, it's just a little fuse cover. Everything's zap strapped in here just to make sure that we're not, we don't have any wires hanging. There is a bundle of wire, an additional bundle of wire in there from the sensors. Awkward position, but that's what you gotta do. So that wire is definitely bundled up with zap straps. You don't want it to get anywhere near your feet. So there you go. Everything's nice and clean and tidy. And now if we turn on the car, oh, I got no battery. Oh, there we go. All right, that was enough. So there's our oil pressure, there's our temperature. It's looking good. All right, here we are with the BRZ. So we're gathering data to see whether or not indeed there is oil pressure drop. The circuit behind us, Vancouver Island Motorsports Park, has a lot of right turns. What data from other people has shown is that the right turns are a problem. So this is what we're looking for. Can we induce this oil pressure drop? Just wanted to get some clean laps out here. Clean laps, more data, so that we can report back to you guys, let you know how things are going, how things are progressing, and if there's any issues that come up. So let's get out there, do some more laps, collect some more data, and then we'll fully check it out. We wanted to get to the bottom of the oil pressure drop, and in order to do that, we installed instrumentation in that car and we took it to 2 different circuits where we collected data on oil pressure drops. What did we find? Well, we did find that indeed, in certain turns, the oil pressure does drop. Now, before everyone goes screaming, ah, right, we've got oil pressure drops, we have to establish certain things. First of all, how much and for how long? When the oil is up to operating temperature, we're about 50 to 60 psi of oil pressure on track. The lowest that we've seen the oil pressure drop at any time is about mid-30s, about 35 psi. And we've seen this drop happen for 1 to 2 seconds max. So the extent of time that the oil pressure was low was quite short, and the oil pressure drop certainly did not go into, you know, the levels that we see at idle. At idle, in this car, we see 13, 14 psi of oil pressure once warm, and this was well above that. So that's the oil pressure side of things. The other side is that we have to be careful about root cause analysis of engine failures. At the end of the day, I mean, oil pressure drop has been associated with the failures that some people have experienced with these cars. And I don't think that it's wise to necessarily say that the failures see it or are there because of this oil pressure drop. The only way to get to the bottom of why these engines fail, and there could be a myriad of reasons, anything from, you know, the user error, such as like what oil is in the car, to how old the oil is, to how hot things get, to are there any design flaws with oiling, are there any design flaws anywhere else in the motor. We need to collect data, and we need to see statistically significant information point towards, hey, this is why we're seeing these failures. So I don't think that a relationship is established yet. There's some things that we've seen. We've seen some oil pressure drops. We've seen some pickup issues where it's clogged up with silicone, but we haven't seen that relationship being established. And we do have a spreadsheet open, a Google spreadsheet to everyone who has an engine failure to document as much as possible what has caused, under what circumstances the failure has happened, and if they do tear down the motor, to look into the telltale signs of, is this an oil starvation problem, is this a clearance problem, is this a heat problem, and so on. So don't jump to the conclusion that oil pressure is, or oil pressure drops on track are indeed the root cause for all failures. However, it's always a good idea to mitigate oil pressure drops. It's always a good idea to maintain oiling in the engine and maintain the oil as healthy as possible. So, in terms of taking action and doing things to your car to improve those things, always a good idea. You can't go wrong. There are some tips that we have. First of all, we know that these cars have the silicone that's floating around the oiling system and that gets sucked up in the pickup. You never want that in any engine. Doesn't matter whether it's this car or another car. You don't want your pickup blocked by anything. So we dropped the pan on this car and we cleaned all that out, and we added a horizontal baffle so that it can help and mitigate some of the high corners where oil sloshes around. Is it going to 100% solve all the oil pressure drop that you're ever going to see? Probably not. However, it is a no-brainer in terms of yes, it's going to help, and there are no drawbacks. So I do recommend, especially if you track the car, you want to keep it beyond warranty, you want to keep it for a while, go through the process. We have a video up of taking the oil pan off, cleaning up silicone until Toyota and Subaru figure out, how not to do that from the factory, and put in an oil baffle. We have those on our website. They are affordable, and if they don't 100% solve oil sloshing, then you're going to at least improve it. If you go on the internet and you look up wet sump systems, you're gonna see that basically every car with a wet sump system, whether it's a Honda, a Mazda, even a Porsche, will have some variations in oil pressure as the oil moves around under high G cornering. So this is not a novel thing, and this is not only a BRZ Gen 2 thing. And then that's why they have, of course, oil baffles in the oil pans and so forth. Number 2, you want to feel good about how your car is running? Put in a monitoring system. So we put in a sandwich plate right here, and we put in an oil temperature and an oil pressure sensor. We ran those to a gauge inside, and now I can monitor this. I can videotape it during tracking, and I can see what is going on. It's important to, especially for you guys, if you want to feel comfortable about how your car's running, to monitor it. Don't just guess. We're gonna have a kit for you guys on our website to easily mount a monitoring system. It's not a huge job. It's actually pretty accessible, and it gives you the information that you need to make a conclusion for yourself. Do you have a problem? Do you not have a problem? Etc. The other aspect of this is the type of oil, the health of the oil that you use, especially when tracking. These cars come with 0 W20 oil from the factory. That's a compromise between efficiency and performance. I recommend that you go with something a little bit heavier. This is because of more viscous oil under higher temperatures, which you see on track, is going to maintain more of its viscosity. And that means it's going to maintain a higher pressure. So perhaps a 5W30, 5W40, depending again on how high your oil temperatures get, and going back to the monitoring, why it's important to monitor this. So we use a 530, we use liquid moly in this car, a high quality synthetic. Quality is important. Modern oils are amazing, but buy high quality oils. And I've even added an additive, a Ceratec additive, which helps not just on track, but it helps, for example, when you cold start your engine, there's not that much oil pressure, it coats the friction surfaces, and it adds another extra layer of protection. If you guys are local to us, especially, we have the liquid moly products here at our shop in Surrey, BC. Drop on by or give us a call, and we can make these available for you for this car and other cars. So oil quality, oil weight, additives, all important to maintain the health of your oil. And this is not just pertaining to, like, let's not make this thing blow up. This is pertaining to longevity, this is pertaining to performance. You can't go wrong with all these suggestions. Finally, you've turned this thing into a monster. You're running 305 tires on it, R compounds. Okay, maybe you've gone beyond what the wet sump system in this motor is designed to do. You're pulling 1.8 Gs around corners. That's amazing. Consider something that's more competition oriented. There's AccuSum systems that can feed some extra oil in there if there's a pressure drop. There's also dry sump systems that you can go, and of course race teams and so on can opt, depending on the tire compound that they use, to go for something like that. However, for the vast majority of you guys out there enjoying these cars, some of the tips that I've given you will help extend the oil life and are no downside upgrades that will allow you to enjoy it more and sleep better at night. So do I think that oil pressure drops are indeed the end of this motor and, you know, all those memes about right-hand turns? Absolutely not. I think you should continue enjoying these cars. They're fantastic cars. They're honestly a fantastic bargain these days when you can have such a nice rear drive, a driver-focused car that you can take on track. You can also drive it around town. So do enjoy the cars. Do enjoy them on track as well as on the street. Take care of them, follow some of our videos and advice, and we put the products and services that help you guys get the most out of your cars right on our website, whether it's tuning, whether it's parts. Give us some feedback on how you're enjoying them, and we'll see you on the next one.